Well, I think we're ready to continue with 1 hour delay. Okay, sorry about this. We'll try to make amends, to try to fix the times. Welcome to this first discussion panel of the conference, but before I do that, I've been told to thank our colleague from the University of Málaga, Marcial García, who's been the one thanks to whom we could have Noam Chomsky's contribution to our inauguration. Anyway, the first session today is Critical Studies in Communication and Imagination, and we have the pleasure of welcoming Athena Athanasiou from the University of Pantheon in Greece and Stephen Duncombe from the University of New York to inaugurate our debates. Thank you very much to both of you for accepting to be here with us today. Before I give the floor to our guests, I'd like to say a few words of introduction about them and about their respective papers, although I'm sure they don't need much introduction. Athena Athanasiou is Associate Professor of Social Anthropology at Pantheon University of Social and Political Sciences in Athens, Greece. She holds a PhD from New School for Social Research and was a postdoctoral fellow at the Pembroke Center for Teaching and Research on Women at Brown University. She has authored the books Life at the Limit, Essays on Gender, Body and Biopolitics, Crisis as a State of Exception, Critiques and Resistances, and she recently co-authored with Judith Butler, Dispossession, the Performative in the Political. Her research interests include gender, feminist and queer theory, biopolitics, technologies of the body, anti-militarist movements, affect, nationalism, and memory. Her new book, Unthinkable Morning, Counter-Memory and Feminist Political Subjectivity in Post-Yugoslavia, will be published by Edinburgh University Press. She's a fellow at the Center for the Study of Social Difference at Columbia University in the working team Rethinking Vulnerability and Resistance, Feminism and Social Change, led by Professor Judith Butler. She's Associate Director of the Nikos Poulantzas Institute. The title of her lecture today is Whither the Demos of Democracy, the Political Performativity of the People, where Dr. Athanasiou will lead us to reflect upon the possibilities opened by the return to popular sovereignty, both in the field of embodied practices of critical agency and in theoretical work on radical democracy. Actually, it is her contention that we should not abandon the task of re-articulating democracy in ways that render it an ever-renewed self-reflective process. As for Stephen Duncombe, he is Associate Professor at the Gallatin School for Individualized Study and the Department of Media, Culture and Communications of New York University, where he teaches the history and politics of media and culture. He is the author and editor of 6 books, including Dream, Reimagining Progressive Politics in an Age of Fantasy, and The Cultural Resistance Reader, and is the creator of The Open Utopia, an open-access, open-source, web-based edition of Thomas More's Utopia. Duncombe is a lifelong political activist and the co-founder and director of the Center for Artistic Activism, a research and teaching institute that trains activists to think more like artists and artists to think more like activists. He's currently working on a book on the art of propaganda in the United States in the New Deal. The title of his lecture is A Spectacular Protest, Communications, Performance, and Political Impact, where he expands on the different embodied forms that radical imagination takes in the face of global neoliberalism. Thus, his talk is in close dialogue with that of Dr. Athanasiou's, since he unfolds the diverse elements of popular protest through the case study of Occupy Wall Street, among others. His analysis will lead us to explore the failures and successes of protest and the implications for enduring political impact. They will have 30 minutes each, and then we'll open to the public for the debate. So without further ado, I now leave the floor first to Dr. Athanasiou and later to Dr. Duncombe. Thank you to both of you.
Thank you, Maria José, for this introduction. And I must say that I'm very pleased to be here from such a remote country, Greece, which used to be on the periphery of Europe, but now it seems to be moving towards the center of the attention of the world. And I think it's very interesting that peripheral countries can step into the center only by virtue of a crisis. And I'm very pleased to be here at the university with a very interesting tradition in the interdisciplinary study of social change. I would like to thank my hosts and organizers of the conference for inviting me, and many thanks to all of you for attending this session today. So my title is Whither the Demos of Democracy, the Political Performativity of the People. And I'm going to read my written text first because I'm speaking in a foreign language, and second because I have a very strong attachment to texts. So my presentation is going to be very textual and theoretical in a way. So I will start with an excerpt from Jacques Derrida's book, Spectres of Marx. Here goes: the effectivity or actuality of the democratic promise, like that of the communist promise, will always keep within it, and it must do so, this absolutely undetermined messianic hope at its heart, this eschatological relation.
Hold on, I think that there are problems with your mic. Yeah, they're going to change it.
So I couldn't be heard? I mean, shall I?
At the beginning, yeah, you want to start? The beginning?
Am I all set?
Yeah.
Okay. So I was saying that I'm starting with Jacques Derrida's Spectres of Marx. Maybe it's too early in the morning for talking about spectres, but the idea is that there's no other way to speak about democracy and the demos except for summoning some specters here. So that's what we're going to do today. So here it goes, the excerpt goes: the effectivity or actuality of the democratic promise, like that of the communist promise, will always keep within it, and it must do so, this absolutely undetermined messianic hope at its heart, this eschatological relation to the to come of an event, and of a singularity, of an alterity that cannot be anticipated. So I would like to expand a little bit the concept of what Derrida calls democratic promise by turning to a visual trace from a book block, what has been called book block, which is a mode of street action in which protesters marched wearing mock books as shields in the streets of Rome, London, and other cities in 2010 in defense of public universities and libraries. And I think this is a visual trace which epitomizes, in a way, the spirit or the specter of our time. So you can see a policeman raising his baton against a protester who carries a book sign of Jacques Derrida's Spectres of Marx. Now, since I venture to call this visual material and affective residue a trace, I have already inscribed myself into the task of being concerned with how the trace in Derrida puts into question the idea of presence or the present. In his study on Husserl, speech and phenomena, Derrida defines the constitution of a trace as, I quote, a possibility that must not only inhabit the pure actuality of the now, but must constitute it through the very movement of difference it introduces, end of quote. In Of Grammatology, Derrida employs the trace to extend the notion of writing in ways that include infinite iterabilities, which make writing possible through the erasure of the proper name. This is about a peculiar actuality, one that is generative and at the same time affected and inflected by boundaries and foreclosures, one that repeats indifference, and one that, in presenting itself, it becomes erased. Now that we have indicated the actuality of the democratic promise through the idea of the trace, and thus as neither wholly present nor wholly absent, let me go back to the book block and the figure of the policeman which in chasing specters of Marx, as you can see here, unwittingly recalls and re-embodies the Derridian explication that the spectral is indeed the disturbingly undead. At the same time, another trace, the trace of violent sovereignty that haunts democracy, is exposed and thus rendered vulnerable to expropriation. In fact, the scene is an expository moment that seems to highlight not a single act, but the repeated and ritualized performance of police brutality, which marks, in its sheer pervasiveness, current context of neoliberal autarkic democracy. However, despite the current and ongoing reduction of democracy to a kind of indifferent proper name of capitalist governmentality that dismantles critical thinking, politics, and the public, traces are always left and traces are produced, thus opening the political to the shared contingency of democracy to come. As a scene that enacts the relation between law and literature, the book block opens to other bodies, inscriptions, and possibilities. The list of the books that have been seen in the affective alliances of the book block suggestively denoted a long chain of undead critical literatures and epistemologies, from Theodore Adorno's Negative Dialectics to Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own, from Mary Shelley's Frankenstein to Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot, and from Donna Haraway's Cyborg Manifesto to Judith Butler's Gender Trouble, and many, many others. In the book blocks, people have taken to the streets to fight for critical thinking and public education, turning books into banners and shields against educational cuts and neoliberal regimes of university governance. But that uncanny image of the armed policeman chasing both the unarmed specters of Marx and their concomitant literatures, namely social sciences and humanities, emerged to remind us that those recurring and floating specters will haunt capitalism and its epistemes. So I seek to understand here how this haunting might involve a return of democracy as a political configuration which expropriates the proper from its normative conditions of properness and property. Derrida's Spectres of Marx calls for a new reading and reappropriation of Marxism and its legacies. Like Marx and Engels, who began their 1848 Communist Manifesto by invoking a spectre haunting Europe, which they called communism, Derrida started off his book by invoking ghosts, in the plural this time. What might this affective structure of spectrality relate at this momentous historical time to the return and reinvention of communism? And I think I cannot be heard.
Yes. The poor technicians are going nuts.
I was cut while uttering the word communism.
And specters.
Yeah, specters.
I hope it's not again censorship against specters. That's the good thing about the specters, that they cannot be censored.
Yes.
In a way. Thank you. So the return and reinvention of communism in left discourses and imaginaries. How is this return of popular sovereignty manifested in embodied practices of critical agency and current theoretical work on radical democracy? And how might radical democracy work to deconstruct both the economic governmental rationality of late capitalism and the consensus that democratic formalism seems to instigate today among the most fervent guardians of the neoliberal rule and the colonial history of the West? The spectre that has been haunting the world since 1848 is mobilized today in various protests of recent years to challenge the present dissolution of democracy into a synonym for prosperous bourgeois West, free market economy, and liberal globalization. At stake in my presentation today is a particular sense of democracy, the one related to the political self-rule of, the one related to the political self-rule by the people. As it is claimed, and this is a quote from Wendy Brown, from her latest book, The Political Self-Rule by the People. As it is claimed and performed in context of market democracy, despite and against norms of competitive individualism and the post-democratic objection of the masses and the reduction of politics to management. My reflections are informed by current political enactments and struggles that cast democracy as a renewed modality of resistance and popular sovereignty. Therefore, although I'm firmly critical of late modern actually existing governmental configurations conveyed by the sign of democracy, my perspective also stands apart from analyses that discard democracy by identifying it with capitalism. I'm not proposing that we should lazily exhaust our political inventiveness and imagination to defending democracy, for sure not the actually existing one. Rather, I'm seeking to think on and with political aspirations to defend in the sense of revitalize what has not yet taken place, what has fallen short of its promise. What I claim is that the political forms with which we experiment should not abandon the ideal of democracy defined as a continuous political project of shared rule of the people. Especially in the conditions in which we today find ourselves, when neoliberal governmentality invests in the destruction of even the possibility for democracy, and when fascist hatred of democracy is on the rise. The task for thought is to engage in struggles for re-articulating the coming to being of democracy in ways that render it an ever-renewed, self-reflective, revolutionary process. I aim principally to rethink the democratic body politics forming in the anti-austerity protest sphere within regimes of power that subsume the political under the post-political discourse of debt crisis and market management. What emerges as the connective tissue among several of these political enactments is the desire to defend the democracy that has been gained through past anti-authoritarian, anti-dictatorial movements, for example, in Spain and in Greece, and simultaneously the desire and struggle for a democracy yet to be acquired and reclaimed from capitalism. So I would like to ask what it is that mobilizes radical social imagination in times of neoliberal governmentality. This break with the managerial logics and logistics of crisis inscribes an openness to come and constantly pushes toward the not yet here, beyond the order of accumulating capital and poverty and against the recurring fascisms and racisms. My purpose is to unravel the performative qualities of such critical contestation at the heart of loss. Loss of public education and health, work, housing, means of livelihood, rights, dignity, and democracy. In other words, the emergent processes by which embodied subjects simultaneously produced and foreclosed via multiple regulatory schemas return to the space of their erasure and in various contexts of unevenly distributed affectability. I seek to attend to the plurality, undecidability, and discenteredness of the people as an event of political performativity, which might undo the established power knowledge matrices regulating which and how bodies are made to appear, endure, matter, and act as a we. Neoliberal governmentality is about rendering economy a pervasive rationality and significantly subjecting all modes of the political, including subjectivation, to this domination. In operating on desires and aspirations, along with coercion and control, neoliberalism denotes an authoritative rationality and apparatus of producing dispensable and disposable populations. Within the purview of this governmentality, the biopolitical imaginary and administration of life and death is reconfigured as resources and vulnerability are differently and unevenly distributed among different bodies, differently economized, racialized, and gendered bodies. Michel Foucault has summarized the neoliberal way in which people are made subjects thus. He says, Homo economicus is an entrepreneur of oneself. Now, the role of the state and state institutions is to ensure and safeguard the pervasive functions of the market. In Foucault's words again, to govern for the market, not because of the market. This is from his lectures, which came out under the title Birth of Biopolitics. So governance for the free market entails the upward redistribution of wealth and thus demands the dispossession of bodies, spaces, rights, common resources, and livelihoods. For the free market and consumer fantasies and profits to be enjoyed by some, others must be rendered cheap, reserved labor, utterly exploitable, dispensable, and disposable. This perspective runs counter to a teleological conceptualization of governmentality as a form of rule which gradually displaces those technologies of power, namely sovereignty and discipline, that are considered more archaic, more repressive, authoritarian, irrational, or uneconomic, if you want, than governmental technologies. In this light, neoliberal rationalities and techniques of power involve an articulation between productive and destructive aspects of power, discipline and freedom, choice and competition, authoritarianism and self-determination. The current crisis of late capitalism compels, I think, a rethinking of capitalism through the very heterogeneous forces of its own becoming. Regrettably, however, as Wendy Brown very rightly notes in her latest book, Foucault's analysis of neoliberal reason in his 1978-79 Collège de France lectures did not include a concern with the effect of neoliberal governmentality on the political body and on democratic imaginaries. So, I want to ask here, how might we ask the question of the demos of democracy with Foucault's ideas on neoliberal reason, but also despite his analytical devaluation of both democracy and capital? Or, to formulate the question closer to our purposes here, how might we think together a neoliberal politics of emergency and a democratic politics of emergence? A politics of emergence taking place on the level of the demos and its political performativity. And since I began this text today by gesturing towards a moment of collision of state violence with Derrida's inherited specters of Marx, let me consider how the actuality of the democratic promise is reanimated by the tenor of the political deconstructive project. One such space of possibilities, I want to claim, is the university. A space where these and other texts might be read and reread, construed and destabilized, imagined, archived, disseminated in Derrida's sense, and ultimately, as the book block shows, embodied and reenacted. When we wear our books and their bodies of matter to defend in public and with others public higher education and libraries, either in accordance with or despite the intentions of these books' authors, we perform this possibility. Now, the loss of the critical possibility for public and democratic higher education signifies the collective loss of a public space for animating the possibility for critical reading, thinking, and acting. This possibility has everything to do with the ways in which these books have come about and been put together. As the intimate public of the book block enacts in protest the growing corporatization of higher education in Europe and around the world, is premised upon a conception of knowledge as commodified property and a measurable commercial asset that needs to be immediately available to the entrepreneurial agendas of global elites. As the university turns into an area regulated by market standards, its corporate governmentality makes sure that it is accountable to these business elites through regimes of knowledge, commercialization, and quantitative assessment. Any other future for the university is considered impracticable, non-viable, in a word, impossible. To be clear, my point here is not to downplay the university's institutionalized effects of power sedimentation. Universities have always been places of entrenched authority, privilege, and hierarchies. My point here, rather, is to ask what kind of critique could be articulated to make sense of and to make a claim for what I call alternative humanities. Alternative humanities in both senses of the word, both alternative to high culture as the essence of humanism and humanity, and as an alternative configuration of what counts and matters as human. What is there to be reclaimed then, when precarious bodies and books assemble in a crowd laying claim to the public at a moment marked by the corporatization of the public? And this is to trace the performativity of critical agency in terms of collective dissent that works to displace the preconditions by which the normativity of the political is produced and sustained, including, of course, the standards of self-willed individualism, but also the norms of bourgeois, white, male heteronormativity. As Wendy Brown develops in her latest book, neoliberal governance eviscerates the very space of the demos, the democratic space in which people assemble to articulate common claims of freedom, equality, and justice. Citizenship is being relegated simply to the medium through which the market administers public life and what they call human capital. In examining challenges for democracy generated by austerity politics, Brown argues that the values of democracy are undermined today not only by the unfettered power of finance capital and by extreme economic inequality, but also by a normative economic mode of reason and governance that undoes the constituent terms of democracy, namely freedom, equality, popular sovereignty. So the demos, in all its undertones of ancient Greek polis or city-state, cannot easily evade, I think, and I want to insist on that, cannot easily evade the genealogy of violent demarcations, hierarchies, and exclusions, such as those of women, slaves, and foreign residents. This definition, however, does not exhaust its range of meanings and aspirations, and thus I suggest that the demos is understood through the conceptual framework of performativity as a plurality of dispositions, whereby what is at stake is what kinds of imaginaries of a radical democratic political would be prompted by this provisional political articulation of we. I want to suggest that we need the political notion of the people not only as a radical response to the ontoepistemologies of the human capital, but also at the same time one that radically differs from racist and neo-fascist configurations of the people as closed, solid, homogeneous, racially poor or ethnically pure and gender hierarchical entity. As we have learned from a few years of austerity in Greece and in Spain and all over Southern Europe, neoliberal rationality is neoconservative rationality, which entails the intensification of social inequalities, including gendered and racialized ones. In order to better understand the normalizing force of neoliberal governmentality, we have to come up with a broader notion of dispossession, one that involves not only the dispossession of lands, but also of bodies, crucially including the dispossession of women's and migrants' precarious labor or the reduction of this labor to a precarious labor par excellence. Herein lies the urgent significance of critical epistemologies that insist on addressing simultaneously the colonial, racial, capitalist, post-colonial, and heteronormative matrices of liberal democratic intelligibility. Such perspective would account for what remains unaccounted for in several current understandings of political action. 5 minutes. Okay, to speed up a little bit. In reading Hannah Arendt's conception of the policy's enactment as a space of appearance, Judith Butler has argued that in laying claim to the public, collective actions reconfigure the matter of the body politic. As she puts it, we miss something of the point of public demonstrations if we fail to see that the very public character of the space is being disputed and even fought over when these crowds gather. Now, a performative politics of protest reclaims the unconditionality of public space, demanding a democracy with demos and enacting a demos with differences. The reconfiguration of the we, the people, however, when no such space of intelligibility is in place in the existing order of things, performs a tenuous self-designation to which one does or does not belong, from which some of us are left out, and to which we are interpellated in ambivalent and even injurious ways. In other words, the performativity of the we, the people, is contingent upon all the stratifications of omissions and exploitations that manifest the power relations determining who the we is. Judith Butler has explored the phrase we the people as an illocution, that is, as an utterance which provokes action, a speech act fundamentally related to the physicality of bodies actively making their appearance in the public, either as anti-neoliberal protesters or as transgender in a transphobic environment, or as criminalized, undocumented migrants. These assembled bodies, vulnerable but also dissenting, enact a form of political exposure. In Butler's account, the assembled bodies come to be through their political exposition and action in the public. At the same time, their exposition yields or makes possible a call to action. Okay, to speak. Sorry about that. So the conception of the people that I'm developing here is not resonant with the purity of the single and extraordinary event. In fact, it is not resonant with any purity whatsoever. Rather, it addresses the aporias and complexities that mark the processes of subjectivation through which subjects come to being as political subjects. It seeks to stand as a critique of both the managerial evisceration of the people and the conception of a total unified exclusionary demos. This is a quote from Michel Foucault's famous essay on what is critique. What is interesting here is how Judith Butler rereads Foucault's notion of critique by underscoring again the notion of desubjugation. This is a very important concept here. So critique in Foucault and in Butler requires some sense and some practice of desubjugation of the subject in the context of a specific politics of truth. And this is Butler's reading of Foucault's essay, again stressing the concept of desubjugation. As Butler has insightfully made clear, critique involves the practice by which the self forms itself in desubjugation by enacting again and again the question, who will be a subject here and what will count as a life? The current regimes of crisis provide the grounds for a critical re-engagement with who counts as part of the public, how the political is performed, how and where it takes place, what qualifies as political subjectivity, and how this political subjectivity is gendered, racialized, and classed. As I was speaking, as I was saying at the beginning, quoting Derrida, again about the specters of Marx and the spectral return of democracy, as Derrida puts it, that to come suggests that democracy will always remain aporetic in its structure. In other words, always deferred and yet present as an iterative and disruptive potential in the here and now. Thus understood, the condition of possibility for the people manifests a political performativity of popular power that remains accountable to the aporetic trace of the emergent. Taking up such line of investigation would help make us attentive to the plural and contradictory ways in which emergence emerges within power relations that complicate the unexpected, the dissonant, and the subversive. To conclude then, such ongoing agonistic eventualization encompasses a multitude of political configurations, counter-discourses, and bodily enactments which point beyond the logistics and the logics of accumulating capital and inequality, as well as beyond and against the recurring fascisms and racisms. It reclaims and resignifies the collective space for engaging or re-engaging with the political, with others, and with oneself in ways that make unrealized justice and democracy thinkable and possible again. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Athena. Now it's the turn of Dr. Duncombe.
Thank you.
Whenever you're ready.
Yes, I'll take 1 minute. Hola. And hello and thank you very much for being here. And I want to thank José for inviting me, and Irene for letting me into her class a couple of days ago to meet her wonderful students, and all the organizers of this conference for actually putting on what I know is such a momentous task, and to everybody who is actually here on a beautiful day to listen to us. I'm going to be talking about spectacular protest, and in particular, what its connection to communications is, but also something that I'm very interested in, which is what is its political impact. So I want to start with a premise, that every epoch engenders the form of protest appropriate to the hegemonic power. It's the basic application of the first rule of guerrilla warfare. Know your terrain and use it to your advantage. So if the hegemonic power is local monarchy, autocracy, and dictatorship, the protest is one of mobs and insurrections, a violent overthrow of the centers of power. If, on the other hand, it is national representative democracy, then the form of protest are petitions and marches. This is the Chartist movement in England in delivering the petition to Parliament, and that it's representations of the people in physical time and space directed towards power, Parliament buildings, Capitol buildings, and so on, which continues really up until our present day, or near present day. This is the famous March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom in 1963, which was very much a representation of the people marching on power. But we don't live in this world anymore. We live in this world. And I think it's quite telling. When I was looking for an image for global power and global communications, the only ones I could find were copywritten by Getty Image. That even the images themselves have been privatized. And these are the idea of decentered power traveling around global networks of communication and transportation, what Hart and Negre defined as empire in their book. And of course, the response is in line with this, which is we have mediated images of dissent, revelations of injustice, performances of an alternative, created for global audiences and directed towards networks of communications. And the civil rights movement was actually one of the first movements to understand this, is that not only did they act in such a way as to represent the people and march on Washington, they also performed for cameras. The great civil rights historian Douglas McAdam once called Martin Luther King a genius for strategic dramaturgy, insofar as they staged their demonstrations to be seen around the world, particularly to be seen around the world in the context of the Cold War. Here's an image from the levitation of the Pentagon, an absolutely absurd protest in which people encircled the Pentagon hoping to levitate it. And of course, that wasn't the point. The point was the idea of it and the images which could actually flow from it. More recently, of course, the Zapatista movement, a very defined local struggle, but one which was simultaneously created for global communications. The altered globalization movements across the world. This is from the G8 summit. And this is a database that I've created. It's called Actipedia, which is a user-generated database of creative activism, of which there's now 1,000 examples from around the world of performative protest. They, again, staged for very local reasons, but with an eye to a global media. That is, events that are created to be mediatized. So there's traditional ways, academic ways of understanding protest. Resource mobilization, what resources are available to whom, political opportunity, historical openings and crises, relative deprivation, the famous gets-wants gap, and collective identity, subcultural identity formation through social movements. And all are useful in understanding why people protest, but they don't say much about how protest works. That is, what is their form? And so what I want to do is a little case study to look at 2011, in particular Occupy Wall Street. 2011 was certainly a year of spectacular protest. Here's Tahrir Square in Egypt, here's May 15th in Madrid, and Occupy Wall Street in the United States, and of course many, many other places around the world. All of which took the double meaning of the word demonstration, and it works in Spanish as well with manifestación. They take that sort of double meaning, which is, it is both a political protest, but it is also to show or communicate. That is, literally to demonstrate or to manifest. And so what I want to argue here is that we have to understand these forms of protest as communicative action, performances designed, consciously or not, to intervene in a mediated global discourse and to impact public opinion. And I want to drill down a little bit and look at Occupy Wall Street, which is a case study I know well because I was part of it. And I want us to think about Occupy Wall Street as a stage, literally a theatrical stage for communications. That is, a stage for external communications. There's an external audience, a mass media which is tied into a 24/7 news cycle, had a reliable stage to go down to and transmit a story about what was actually happening. It was a stable platform for a performance. But also, very importantly, for an internal audience, that is, participants and the media of the social movements themselves, controlling the message, spreading the news, creating an idea of global solidarity as these images got bounced to Spain, got bounced to Egypt, and around the world as well. But for both an internal and external audience, what was happening was a prefigurative performance, insofar as what was being performed was a demonstration of a world that actually could be. And I'm going to give a couple of examples of that. One is the General Assemblies. And the General Assemblies were how decisions got made. They were horizontal, decision-making bodies where everyone got to speak and consensus was the goal. Now, if anybody's ever been part of a General Assembly, the first thing you realize is that they don't work at all. That is, nothing gets done, people speak till late at night, and only those people that don't have jobs and children and all sorts of responsibilities can stay and actually make a decision. And so they don't actually work for what their intended purpose is, but they do work as a performance of a radically democratic communitarian political process where everyone is heard. That is, they work as a symbol and as a performance, even if they don't work in terms of their stated functionality. And I'm going to give you a little bit of an example of this. Let's see, whoops. Let's see if this works. Yes, it actually works. This never works. This is a General Assembly in Washington Square Park in New York City.
I'm with the Direct Action Working Group. I'm with the Direct Action Working Group. Next up. Is arts and culture. Is arts and culture. Hi everyone. Hi everyone. I'm Mike with arts and culture.
Okay. You might have noticed they have a particular form of communication, which was something called the people's microphone. And it was developed in response to the police not allowing protesters to actually have megaphones. And so the only way one could actually speak across long distances would be to call a mic check, then I say a few words, and then the last people that can actually hear then repeat those words and onwards until, in this case, it went back about 3 or 4 cycles. I also want to argue that it didn't work either. Insofar as you couldn't communicate anything more than 4 words or 5 words, which was quite humorous when intellectuals would come down like Slavoj Žižek and try to talk, because everything got reduced to sound bites. And so as a mode of communications, it actually limited communication. But again, it worked as a model, as a performance of a decentered horizontal communications, as a symbol of collective communications in which every word became the words of everybody in the actual organization or the protest. It wasn't the man with the megaphone that could actually make decisions and thereby get attention. It had to be communicated by everyone. Another interesting aspect of Occupy Wall Street was signs, thousands of contradictory signs. And this was something which in the movement and in the mainstream media got a lot of attention, which is there was no unified message coming out of the movement because everyone had their own signification, their own signs. But I think, again, if you look at it differently, you start to understand that the plurality of signs taken together communicates an ideal of democracy as discussion and dissension, okay? Sort of democracy as, say, Rancière or Mouffe, Chantal Mouffe would understand it, rather than adherence to a singular ideology. That is, quite literally, this is what democracy looks like. And the final aspect I want to talk about is another peculiar thing that happened both at Occupy Wall Street, but in occupations around the world, which actually resonates a little bit with what Athena was talking about, which was the creation of public libraries. Not just public libraries, but public kitchens, public prayer sites, public yoga studios. Again, the public libraries didn't really work. No one ever returned the books. They just took the books, and that was the end of that. Now, there's 2 ways to read this. Charitably as a gift economy, or uncharitably as the problem of the free rider. But either way, I think to look at the functionality of the library in terms of traditional libraries is to miss the point. What they did was that they worked as a participatory, interactive experience and visual symbol of a non-market mode of exchange. A free, cooperative institution devoted to the expansion and enrichment of the public, an alternative humanities, as Athena was talking about. A public institution which, of course, had been undermined in the real world by neoliberal privatization. And in such a way, it was sort of an act of strategic nostalgia, okay? Which is to put the idea of a public service out there as a symbol to be communicated. So how do we make sense of this form of spectacular demonstrations? And I would say is to understand them as performances meant to be communicated through media and communications. To update Walter Benjamin's famous observation that the work of art reproduced becomes the work of art designed for reproducibility, we might say that protests in an age of global communications are those staged to be reproduced and disseminated on a global scale. Not always consciously as such. Die-hard occupiers will insist that GAs actually function as decision-making bodies, and Occupy librarians I've talked to are horrified at my suggestion that the libraries serve primarily a symbolic function. Yet whether consciously or not, they were a natural reaction, I would argue, and that's in quotes, to operating upon our highly mediated political terrain. That is, they operated as a form of communications themselves. Now, the function of protest is not just communications. It's actually to challenge and transform power. So I want us to think about, did they actually work? That is, what was the efficacy of this model of protest? And using the three examples I put up from 2011, the results are decidedly mixed. Here's Tahrir Square today. The political ground was seized by the better organized Muslim Brotherhood, and then, of course, they were deposed, and there's a return to power of the military and political elite in Egypt. There is Zuccotti Park today. There's a dissipation of a movement, although a shift in discourse to acknowledge, albeit in a much less radical form, the problem of economic inequality in the United States. If these were the only examples to consider, the analysis of the impact of these sorts of protests would be quite sobering. There seems to be a flaw in this spectacular protest and its ability to actually deliver the goods. And perhaps what it is a mismatch between the form of contemporary political protest and the necessities of contemporary political organization and social change. That is to say, all communication systems carry within them protocols for engagement, that is, ways of understanding and acting in the world. For example, the book. You read one word after the next. One paragraph leads to the next paragraph. You have a beginning, a middle, and an end. It leads to a sort of linear thinking and planning. That is, a planning of strategy. Whereas this is my desktop on my computer. There's no linear thinking here whatsoever. It's about multitasking, time shifting, hyperlinking, networking, and above all, nonlinearity. That is, a type of being in the world, a type of communicating in the world that lends itself to the immediate and the expressive or the tactical. That is, spectacular protests are by and large a tactic, and what seems to be absent is what is needed for substantial and sustainable social change, which is strategy. Digging a little bit deeper into this difference is to think about speed. That is, communications of spectacle is instantaneous, whereas political organization is about duration over long periods of time. The civil rights movement in the United States, for example, while we remember those images from the mid-60s, had been in existence formally since the 1920s and informally since moments of abolition 150 years previously. We also need to think about scale. The communications of spectacle is global and diffuse, whereas political organization tends to be concentrated and directed towards centers of power. And finally, experience, both of the activists themselves. That is that performing is different from enacting. And perhaps Aristotle was right in the Poetics, that acting out the revolution does not lead to enacting the revolution, but actually works as a form of catharsis. And also the experience of the audience for these performances. Spectacle engages the masses via the media as spectators. Political organization, at least democratic political organizations, demands participation. We experience the reproduced experience alone, on our screens, isolated, even if we are part of a larger group who's also watching the same thing, whereas political change has traditionally come through mass action. Again, one might draw a depressing conclusion from this, that all protest in an age of global communication embodies a fatal flaw. It works as a spectacle, It works as communications. It works as affective expression. And this is, of course, a great example of this sort of spectral politics, the specter of democracy. The first hologram protest in Spain in April 10th of this year. And of course, it didn't look like this on the street. On the street, you could actually see the screen upon which it was, what is the word?
Projected.
Projected, thank you for my English. Projected upon. But as an image, it worked quite wonderfully. But while it works as communications, it may not work as a form of organization and power that can bring about sustainable social change in the material world. So it's helpful, I think, to think of this in terms of communications protocol. Spectacular protest cannot interface, perhaps, with contemporary politics, governmentality, and contemporary political power as it is right now. And like the old modems that some of us remember, they would do that ding, 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 and they'd finally connect with one another, they call out for a response that they may never receive. But again, I don't think such a pessimistic view is entirely warranted. One might plausibly argue that while it's true that spectacular protest is calling out for a form of politics that is not there, this is exactly its point. By calling out in a new language, a new form, a new protocol, it is asking us to bring into being a politics which can reply. And it may be useful here to think of Althusser's idea of hailing. The revolutionary political problem with protocols is that in the effort to communicate what is already an accepted protocol, you inevitably reproduce it. In an effort to be legible, you reinscribe the status quo. To really change the world, we need a new language, a new communications, a new way of being and acting in the world. To borrow a phrase from Jacques Rancière, a new distribution of the sensible has to be created. In other words, spectacular politics are prefiguring in the form of communications a new structure of politics that needs to be built out in the world of politics and power. That's the theory. On a more practical level, I spoke of Tahrir Square and Occupy Wall Street. But what of the uprising in Tunisia, the first of this string of spectacular demonstrations in 2011 that brought a democracy into being? Or what of Greece and the rise of Syriza? Or closer to home, the lasting legacy of May 15th, the continuation and spread of protest in Spain, the Indignados movement, and the rise of Podemos? How do we explain this? What factors facilitated the move from protest as communications to political organization and potentially power? Is, for example, Podemos an example of the organizational realization of the communicative form prefigured within this form of protest? And that's not a mismatch, but a catching up of reality to the imaginary? Or is it just an effort to put new wine into an old bottle? I can't answer these questions. But hopefully we can in this conference. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much to both of you. Thank you especially for sticking so closely to our time. So now is the turn to open the debate. Finally, we can all start talking together, okay? And we can introduce and interpolate the audience, and the audience can interpolate our guests. Anyone having any comment, reflection, question?
Hola. La pregunta la puedo hacer en inglés o en español. Como...
In English, please. Well, if you cannot do it in English, wait and she will.
Oh.
Can you do it in English?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
I forgot mine.
No, that's okay. She's gonna do it in English.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, it was, if I understand well, what you were saying was that there's a process in the protest that you have like the image, the mobilization, I don't know if this word exists in English, and that moves into proceso catártico.
A cathartic process.
Yeah.
Cathartic process, yeah.
And after that, then you have like the organization, and the organization of the movement will be also a transformation. My question is, do you think that the only participation is a transformation of the political life? And if we can understand that the transformation between mobilization to a movement and then to the creation of power or creating autonomy or resistance, that's a transformation for me. Like, I don't think that it's being outside, it's a transformation now. Like, my question is why it's not.
Sure.
Is it for Steven or for Athena?
Okay.
Steven.
Although I'm interested in what you think too. I understand. If I understand your question correct, it's why am I saying that the realization, the proper political realization of this form of protest needs to be in the form of governmentality, or at least taking the role of the state or taking over state functions. That is there actually the realization of this sort of world can be autonomy? Part of me agrees with you, particularly when we start thinking about that one of the things that these prefigurative protests do is transform the discourse by which we even understand what politics is, right? And insofar as it stays within that sort of world of culture, it can have profound effects insofar as it defines politics in a way that we don't even understand it today. Well and good. And things are so bad. So many people are being thrown out of their homes or locked up in jail and the inequality of wealth is so extreme that I think we need state power. I think the left has to take state power, and the question is, what sort of power do we take? But I think the idea of protest as something which is only against and then has some sort of value as an autonomous sphere, I once believed that. I don't believe that anymore.
Do you want to contribute to what Steven said?
Yes, sure. This is a very interesting question and thoughtful one. I'm thinking that what today's creative social movements keep teaching us is precisely the importance of how we are supposed to learn how to imagine in a better way, how to organize in a better way, and not only how to fail better, to use Slavoj Žižek's famous saying, that the whole point about politics is to learn how to fail better. We have to fail every time. Partly I agree with him, but it's time for the left, I agree with Steven, to learn how to handle our victories, if I might say so. And of course, I think that the main challenge for alternative politics today, including the politics of the left, is to direct to the demand for power, trying to take the power, but not in the usual way, not in the in accordance with the established regime of intelligibility about what counts as politics. So we have to reinvent politics, the political subjectivity, as I try to develop. And I think what we both developed, if I can talk about you too, is this importance of kind of affective aesthetics of dissent. So the question is, how can we establish a democracy, a radical democracy, which incorporates this element of dissent, of disagreement?
Yeah. Excellent.
Oh, okay.
Hola, buenos días. Voy a hablar en español.
Okay.
Can you just change that to me? No. Just when she says it, you can repeat it to me.
Yeah. But do you need to go and grab your headphones?
No.
Okay.
Solamente es una reflexión, un ejemplo. Yo soy de Guatemala.
¿Eres qué?
Hablando de las
¿Qué eres? Perdona, es que tengo que...
Soy de Guatemala.
Ah, ok.
Guatemala.
Sí, Guatemala.
Entonces, hablando del poder de las movilizaciones o de las protestas, solo quería dar un ejemplo. Hace 3 semanas, la población pues, se ha movilizado dentro del país. Empezó una protesta contra la corrupción de los, bueno, en este caso de la presidencia, vicepresidencia, y no existía en ningún momento un grupo definido que movilizara a toda la población, sino a través de las redes sociales, de igual forma, llegaron, era el pueblo sin ningún líder, sin nadie, y finalmente después de aproximadamente tres movilizaciones más, durante 3 semanas continuas realizaron dichas convocatorias y se ha logrado pues que en este caso una de las mandatarias, que era la vicepresidenta, renunciara al poder, y actualmente, como se realizó todo esto, ya los movimientos sociales u otras organizaciones ya empezaron a apoyar, pero era como un ejemplo que yo les quería colocar o poner de lo que ha sucedido en mi país. Actualmente siguen las movilizaciones, no sé hasta dónde vamos a llegar, porque están pidiendo incluso que renuncien presidentes y otras cuestiones, y los medios de comunicación en algún momento también se pusieron contra de ellos, porque en ningún momento dieron la voz de lo que estaba sucediendo. Todo fue a nivel pues, de redes sociales solamente.
Gracias.
Okay, thank you. There were more with it.
I'd like to raise the issue of what the definition of democracy is. I noticed in the first talk there seemed to be no interrogation of different conceptions of democracy, and there seemed to be I see a typical illusion of left-wing thinkers that democracy is what happens when people agree with us, rather than a conception of democracy where a lot of people will inevitably not agree with the left. And there seemed to be an assumption of inclusive politics, including lots of groups which the left has sympathy with, but there's an ominous omission of groups which the left doesn't particularly want to deal with, for instance, like small businessmen or working class people who've lost their jobs due to immigration. And I'd like to ask, even when is there going to be a more materialist and realist look at what power involves? And is there an interest there in having a dialogue with different conceptions of political theory, political practice, which seem to be absent in the 2 talks?
Thank you.
Let you take them.
Athena, that's for you.
Let me try. This is a very complicated question, obviously. I'll try to respond to this. You're right, there's a wide spectrum of different perceptions of democracy. And I try to situate myself in a way within this wide spectrum. But basically what I think is that it would be politically significant to perceive democracy as a signifier which exceeds itself, which has no fixed meaning in a way. Because you see, democracy is, well, first of all, etymologically speaking, it's a very paradoxical concept. Right? It's demos and kratos. Demos, the people, and power. So this paradox is a very enabling one too. So we have to address this. That's one. Second, I think there's an interesting mutual complicity between democracy and spectrality. And to my mind, spectrality is not something non-realistic. Quite the contrary, people like Etienne Balibar, for example, have been talking about the quintessentially unfinished character of democracy. And I'd like to think of democracy in this way, as something that does not have to do with a kind of a fixed formality of how things are supposed to be done. Of course, this is involved, this is encompassed too in the whole conceptual trajectory of what democracy is about. But talking about the radical politics of democracy, I think that we have to maintain this open, unfinished character of democracy as an enabling point of departure. I think that this goes back to how democracy is fed by a whole genealogy of Marxism too. That was another point that I tried to make today. I think that it's worth going back to revitalizing a Marxism without a theological foundation. A Marxism which is hospitable to new social movements and one which is open to new definitions of democracy. And this goes back to the definition of the subject of democracy too, right? I mean, democratic politics requires some sense of subject. And then the question becomes, how are we supposed to define the subject? And if we go on defining the subject in a very fixed and stable way, then we're doomed to reproducing exclusions, all kinds of exclusions. I'm afraid to say that in Greece at least, and I'm sure in other places too, the extreme right-wing group, Golden Dawn and others, speak in the name of the people. So this is something that we have to bear in mind, that how is this notion open to expropriations and re-expropriations? So, to conclude, I think there's a very fraught politics of positionality that is involved in this kind of defining and redefining democracy. It's not a conceptual question, it's a political question, how democracy is to be defined.
Thank you. Next question.
Thank you. My name is Price Mark Apreko, and I'm doing my studies here in Ohi. My question, I believe it's in a central position between the two expositions that you have made. It borders on democracy as the freedom and the right of people to communicate their intentions, and normally through their human rights. At the same time, the idea of policing is very international. And in the growing spate of people mobilizing for social change, we have had the police also playing a very crucial role. Unfortunately, what I'm discerning is that the police tend to use extreme power to curb people's expression or communication. And throughout the world, the police have operated on, for me, a kind of undefined authority, like the police can charge a group of people for disturbing public peace, public conduct, offensive conduct, that kind of thing. I find this thing increasing both in Africa, which is part of my world, and all other parts of the world. My question then is, how do we handle the police? Because eventually nobody even punishes them, and it is very important for me. Thank you very much.
Good. So this is a great question.
How do we handle the police?
And I think it goes back to what we were talking about, these sort of affective aesthetics. So my other job, outside of being an academic, is I work with activists around the world. And so we were just in South Africa, for example, in Cape Town, working with sex work activists. And we were in Russia before that. And it was very clear we could not get permits to protest, particularly in Russia, and in Macedonia as well. But what we could do is stage art projects. And so one of the ways that I've seen the rise of this sort of aestheticized politics, the spectacular politics, is exactly in places like China, like Russia, like parts of Africa, and actually in New York City, to be honest, where the policing is so intense that as soon as you represent yourself as political, that is, your subjectivity is an activist, you will get shut down immediately. But through a sort of clever strategy of restaging what is politics, in terms of aesthetics and in terms of this sort of affective approach to people, it actually confuses the police to such a point where you actually open up a space. And it doesn't just work well with police. That is, most people don't like protesters. That is, you have a sign up and they walk to the other side of the street, right? Because they've already know the script. They know what you're going to say, they know what you're going to ask them to do, and they want nothing of it. But if you can confuse that moment, so it's a moment of surprise. I don't know what this is. What is this? Let me go check it out. Oh, that's what it is. That's when you have the moment to both evade the police, but also actually to break through the script that people have told themselves over and over about what a protest is. So that's one answer to how to deal with the police.
Would you want to?
Yeah, sure.
Athena?
I totally agree with Stephen. Just to add something very, very little. The question of how to move from policing to politics is a very, I think it's a very fraught question for us participating in the social movements today and in the left, and especially today at the time at which police brutality is a fundamental aspect of how the system works. I mean, it's one of its most unavoidable strongholds. And so policing is a fundamental aspect of how neoliberalism works as a neoconservative authoritarianism. And well, if we manage to avoid, somehow to deal with the violence, the physical violence, I think there's an open possibility for the movements to expose exactly this violent aspect of this neoliberal authoritarian governmentality. And I think one practical way to show this is to remain unarmed, to prioritize politics instead of policing.
May I just intrude, and also because I like this idea of if you confuse the moment, and also linking it to things you write about, and you too, about the place of popular culture in all this performativity of the people. To what extent could popular culture in this scenario precisely be capacitating and opening to ways of confusing?
Sure. Well, I think that the interesting thing about popular culture is it works not as confusion, it works as familiarity, which then gets confused when it's actually bonded towards another politics. And so, using popular cultural tropes that people actually find attractive, that's why they call it popular culture, is actually a wonderful way to get people to actually recognize you, not dismiss you as marginal political, but instead that you speak the lingua franca of the everyday people. And we are everyday people. We like popular culture as much as anybody else. Yet at that same moment, there's that surprise. There's a moment of surprise. I think I'm watching one thing, but then I'm watching something else. And this goes back to what Athena was talking about, which is this notion of the power of politics is actually to confuse the subject, is to actually transform the subject. And so, you think you're moving one way, and then all of a sudden you get hailed to be a different subject. And you're not wholly one or the other, and that creates this very powerful positionality. It's how jokes work, by the way.
Yes, sorry.
First of all, thank you for being here. We are masterpiece students of the university. I have a simple question. You have been talking about the rise of alternative political movements in the world, but you haven't mentioned the role of the media in destroying or satanize the alternative political movement, for example, in Spain, like Podemos, through the setting agenda. What do you think about that?
Do you want to speak to that? Because you probably agree. Okay, I'll start. That's a given. We move on from there. That is, we will never be represented as we want to be represented. And so the only thing you can do is assume you will be misrepresented. And then you move from there. The idea that someday the media and the elite will wake up and say, oh my gosh, look at what these people are doing. We support them. they are right, and we will accurately reflect what they are saying. It's a myth. And so we have to start from saying, no, let's create our own alternative media, or create spectacles which can be only read in one way. And I'll give you a great example. In the United States, there was an activist in the 1960s called Abby Hoffman, who was famous for staging the levitation of the Pentagon. And he knew that any time the mass media would interview him, they would take his ideas out of context and shift it around and make a fool out of him. So what he did is every time he was interviewed, he swore a lot. And they would beep out his swears. And his idea is that they are going to show, whatever they say, they're going to show me speaking and beeping out long sections of my speech. And all of a sudden, to the population, they're going to think he must be saying something incredibly interesting because they're beeping out his speech. And it was this sort of jujitsu, playing with the media and understanding what their limitations are, and then working with them against them.
Great. Yeah, just to add a little bit to that, I think media, for example, from my experience in Greece, for example, media is a device of propaganda against the current government. So I'm talking about the private media. Of course, as you may know, one of the autarkic gestures of the previous government was to close the public broadcaster. So there's no such a thing as a public television or. But I think media politics has all to do with what Jacques Rancière talks about, defines as the distribution of the sensible. There was an interesting anecdote at the very beginning of the negotiation between the new Greek Syriza government and the Troika. There were both Varoufakis, the finance minister, and Dijsselbloem were wearing headphones for the translation. Varoufakis was speaking in Greek, and there was a translation. And we knew already from the translation on the TV that Varoufakis had just mentioned that the Troika is over to Dijsselbloem. And then we're waiting, we're agonizing over Dijsselbloem's response to that. So we're all like that. And there was a time lapse because of the translation. And there was another anecdote. Of course, Varoufakis then, as you may know, he stood up very angry and he left the press, press conference. And that was the beginning of a huge, very heated debate between the two guys and the two institutions and Greek government, so on and so forth. And the anecdote which talked about this moment said that why there was this time lapse on the translation of Dijsselbloem's headphones, and the answer is that the diplomats of the foreign affairs minister did not know how to formulate negative answers at that point. So they had to learn how to say no, how to formulate, the troika is over. So that's an example of this. Re-expropriating the propaganda against itself, reversing it against its own self. Mm-hmm. So that's about the weapons of the weak, of course, because as we know, media is a huge device of sovereignty. Mm-hmm.
We have questions for 5 minutes more.
Does this work?
Yeah.
I have a question for both Athena as for Steven. When you were talking about the fact that the demos, that you wanted to have an inclusive demos, but I wonder myself if demos is not always exclusive. And actually it's very important to be exclusive because that's the way how you politicize things. Mm-hmm. It's to have an enemy of the demos. Which is very important for the struggle itself, which determines the so-called empty signifier of democracy. Now, I still not very sure if democracy should be the signifier we are talking about or should concentrate on, because historically democracy has always been an institutionalization from top to bottom of capitalism to cope with social change. Has been so-called passive revolution, just as fascism has been. For example, the incorporation of universal vote as an answer to World War I and the Russian Revolution. So, in which kind of sense is democracy emancipatory, or is it exactly a very conservative thing? Then I had a question for Stephen. You were proposing the spectacle demonstration as a form of prefigurative politics, as a new kind of being, as it is the use of the symbology is as such not a strategy for social change, but could be a change of normativity. But I would pose it maybe the other way around, in which sense this kind of action is not exactly a reflection of a world where no political alternatives are possible, where actually this is a reflection of capitalist postmodernity, where there is no enemy. And actually, in all those new social movements, you could find elements of this reflection of dominant ideology in their discourse. The concentration, for example, on the idea of corruption as being the primary agent of the bad things in what is going on, actually is a reflection of the discourse of the IMF and the World Bank. How to explain the crisis in south of Europe as a thing of bad management of politicians, of corruption, instead of concentrating on the contradictions of the European capitalist system, of the Eurozone, etc.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was very thoughtful. Thanks a lot. Let me try to respond to this. Is demos an adequate term for addressing today's emancipatory projects? No. But what I try to develop here is that, in a sense, democratic politics requires a kind of democratic reading. So in my reading, democracy should be taken as something that exceeds itself, exactly as you put it, something that exceeds and goes beyond and against its current reduction to neoliberal governmentality and the sheer legitimacy device for the market and capitalist market. That's why I started with this ambivalence between the two names, right? I mean, democracy and communism. And one can trace millions of problems on the other side, you know, on this kind of alternative terminology, which might be communism, and I'm very positive towards that, of course. On the other side, my point is how to use not democracy itself, but the demos as a kind of paleonymy, as Derrida would put it, as an old and saturated concept which is open to new articulations. Why this? Because I think that today neoliberalism is going against democracy. Even parliamentary democracy is totally threatening to neoliberalism. Even that, imagine. I mean, so what I'm saying is that let's take this occasion to re-articulate neoliberalism's current enemy. And this is the demos, this is democracy. But, as I said, not in order to defend what was already there, their democracy, the actually existing democracy, but as an occasion to re-articulate democracy in a different way, which would incorporate the demos, the political subject. So for me, it's just a way to ask the question of how the political is performed today, and what can we do to change that, to provoke some crisis in the current regime of intelligibility that determines what it is, what political is all about. And finally, I think for me is an occasion for asking the question, what qualifies as a political subject today? Now, about your I totally agree with your reference about the exclusionary character of demos. That's a very important, I didn't have time to develop this, but I certainly think about that. And I'm very close to what, again, Jacques Rancière calls the part of those with no part, right? So this kind of demos addresses and readdresses and remobilizes all the injuries and the injustices that have marked the genealogy of what the demos is all about. The politics of gender, class, sexuality, race and ethnicity, all this. So we need this. We need to redress again and again this genealogy of exclusions and hierarchies. And then again, as you very well put it, this is not an all-encompassing political entity. This is not about the metaphysics of a new democracy. This is a way of situating the demos within and beyond the current situation. So if I answered your question.
And I'll answer the question by saying everything that Athena said, just swap in spectacle. Because I actually think that it is exactly what I'm arguing, which is, and I think it's a very great insight that you have, which is if democracy is the dominant form of dominance, spectacular political dominance, the spectacle is the dominant form of cultural dominance. That is the world that we live in. And so the question always is, well, why do spectacle? Why not actually counter it with something entirely different? And I think that it goes back to at least this two things. One is the pragmatic, which goes back to the first rule of guerrilla warfare. Know your terrain and use it to your advantage. This is the world in which we live. Spectacle is the visual lingua franca in which people understand our world, and one needs to be able to speak within it, not to be rendered mute. And spectacle can always exceed itself, and I really like that term, Athena. And I think that I see this in art in particular, in which good art always has a surplus of meaning. That is, that which cannot be reduced to what it is about, but instead has this moment which exceeds itself. And so I'm interested in this use of spectacle sort of against the spectacle. That is, and this is, I wrote a book about this called The Ethical Spectacle, which is how do we create an ethical spectacle? Insofar as using that language, but also using it, or using that form, but using that form in such a way as it can bring about different ends, to be more participatory, more open, more egalitarian, and so on and so forth. Because I think at stake is that what these sorts of actions allow for is opening up a space to think about what are our affective desires, and what do we want, and how do we deal with them. And I think that's a very important place in politics, is not to think of it in the sort of Enlightenment era just of rationality and rigor and discourse, and actually, rationality, and why can I not speak English today? Sober reflection upon facts and so on and so forth, and cognition, but also to understand that politics has always been about affect, it's always been about desire, and that these things actually speak to that desire, and we can learn from it, and we can open up new political spaces.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm afraid we don't have any more time for questioning because we are already running late. We have now a coffee break where we can continue talking about these topics, and we'll continue after the coffee break with the debates and the speakers. Thank you very much to all of you. Thank you to Stephen and Athena.